Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at some headphone cables from Gladiator Cables. So I want to start off by saying a huge thanks to Antonio from Gladiator, who reached out to me via my Instagram feed to ask if I'd like to try out his cables. I of course said yes, I'm always keen to try new and interesting gear, and so Antonio sent me two of his Gladiator range cables. I'll talk about the ranges later, and so I've been playing with them for quite a while now. I think I've had these for a couple of months, so thanks Antonio for your patience. I've been playing around with them to see how I like them, both ergonomically, but also which headphones they suit from a sonic perspective. And now I know that some of you don't like it when I talk about the sound of cables, you don't believe that they make a difference, so I apologise that I am going to talk about both the ergonomics of these cables as well as their sound. You might also notice that I'm trying a slightly different lighting in the office here today, so if you have any thoughts about it, if you like it or don't like it, let me know down in the comments. For now though, let's start talking about the Gladiator cables. These cables start priced at €55, which is around about $60 US, making them a very affordable cable. Now I say they start at €55 because it will depend a little bit on the terminations you choose. Some of the connectors are just more expensive. One of the things that Antonio mentions on the website is that his focus with Gladiator cables is to keep the cables affordable. And certainly from the outset, it looks like he's achieved that. Inside the Gladiator cables, there is a quality Canare wire, and it's specifically a 4x22 gauge wire using 99.9% oxygen-free copper. Something else that Antonio talks about on the website is keeping the capacitance really low. And I talked about capacitance in my recent interconnect review, and the fact that capacitance is basically how much the cable is likely to grab and hold onto that signal, which means that it's then going to release that signal a little bit slower, and that can actually affect the tonality and the sound of the cable. Now, as I said, if you're not a believer in the sound of cables, then don't worry about some of this stuff. You can just ignore it and focus on the ergonomics. But for those that do care about the quality of the cable from a sonic perspective, one of the things that it's nice to see is that Antonio is taking that into account by choosing a good quality wire. Something else that I really like in terms of Antonio's choices are that he's gone to the trouble of also sourcing a wire that's got an environmentally friendly approach. So the insulation underneath the paracord outer here, the paracord being the fabric part, underneath that is a recycled silicone insulation. So I like the fact that these also seem to be an environmentally friendly cable. Moving on from what's on paper to what you get when they're in your hand, and they're a really lovely feeling cable. They're not an extremely high-end sort of boutique feeling cable, but they feel good. The paracord is soft enough to be nice to interact with, but also coarse enough that it doesn't feel like it's going to break or fray easily. We've then got nice amphenol connectors here. These are a high quality connector on par with a Nutric. And then at the other end of this cable is a pair of mini XLR plugs. These are Reen plugs, which are a good quality plug. And at the end of the other cable is a pair of 3.5mm plugs. So Antonio was kind enough to send me two variants of exactly the same cable, and also let me choose some different colors, so I had to play around with some different combinations. And that meant that I was able to try these cables across a wide range of headphones. And I have to admit, the results did actually surprise me. To try to come up with an understanding of how the Gladiator cables performed, how they sounded, etc., I compared them in each case to the stock cable that comes with a headphone. Now I should mention, the headphones I've got sitting here on my stand, I haven't tested them with. These headphones have only just arrived, and these are the HarmonicDyne G200. I've got the review for those coming soon, so make sure you subscribe. But in the meantime, what I tried was putting the Gladiator cables up against some other headphone cables that I had here in terms of the stock cables, with models like HiFiMan's, ZMF's, and even a different HarmonicDyne in the Poseidon. But I'm going to start off talking about the ZMF's. The ZMF range come with a nice quality stock cable. It's not particularly special to interact with. It's got a fairly rubbery feel to it, which some might like, some might not. But it was immediately evident for me when I swapped from the stock cable to the Gladiator cable that I liked the feel of it better. It's a softer, more supple cable, so when it's draping in places, it doesn't hold much shape. It's very soft, very light, and very easy to use. It also looks better if you care about that, and of course you can choose different colours. You don't have to have the combinations I've got here. What I found as I played with the stock cable and the Gladiator cable was the Gladiator cable was actually giving me a slightly better sound. I noticed that the sense of clarity from the Gladiator cable was just a little bit better, and it seemed to bring just a little bit more treble energy, which resulted in a more open overall sound from the Atriums I think I was using it with. When spending this sort of money, so around that $60 mark on an upgrade cable for a headphone, I really expect it to be any better than the stock cables. So I was pleasantly surprised to hear that to me, the Gladiator cable was a sonic upgrade as well as an aesthetic and ergonomic upgrade. And that got me wondering, as these things often do, about how it might compare to my other upgrade cables. And so I plugged in what I normally use with the ZMF headphones, and that's a high quality copper litz cable, and I switched back and forth between the Gladiator and the Aurealis Audio litz cable. Now to put this in perspective and explain what litz is if you're not familiar with it, when you get what's called a litz cable, if it's a proper copper litz cable, what it's going to have is individual strands of copper which are each then covered in their own insulation. So rather than a whole set of strands that are kind of twisted and bundled together inside one outer sheathing, in a litz cable, every single wire has its very own, very thin insulation, and then the whole bundle is insulated as well. In my experience, that often results in a slightly more detailed and cleaner sound, but it's not a guarantee to always be better, particularly when you take into account that the litz cables are almost always going to be more expensive because of all that extra work in insulating each individual strand. And so I was pleasantly surprised to hear that the Gladiator cable for just $60 was easily stacking up next to my relatively expensive litz cable. And in fact, using the Atriums, in some ways I actually prefer the Gladiator cable. I felt like the litz cable opened up the sense of clarity and the space in the soundstage even more, but there was a little bit more sense of body from the Gladiator cable, and it also made everything just a bit more coherent, a bit more kind of glued together. Now as to which one's better, it's going to 100% come down to personal preference. But the good news is that if you're not so sure about spending money on cables, maybe you don't believe they make a sonic difference, then my experience with the Gladiator cables on the ZMF headphones says they're a really, really good option. Ergonomically they're an upgrade, and personally I think sonically they're an upgrade from the stock cable, and comparable even though they're a little bit different from even more expensive cables. And so having determined for myself that the Gladiator cables were a great option for the ZMF headphones, I thought it was then worth going across and trying some planar magnetic headphones with the HiFiMan variant or the 3.5mm variant. The first headphone I tried it with was the Verum Audio Verum 1. And on this occasion I was once again surprised because this time I actually preferred the stock cable over the Gladiator cable. Ergonomically, the Gladiator cable was definitely still my preference, but I felt like that bit of extra clarity and maybe a bit of extra treble energy that it brings to the sound was not necessarily a positive thing on the already relatively bright Verums. They're not a bright headphone as such, but they're pretty neutral and they are a forward and detail-focused headphone. And so for me, adding the Gladiator cable didn't do them any favours. It threw the tonal balance off just a little bit compared to the stock cable. Having heard that, I put down the Verums and reached for the HiFiMan Arya Stealth Magnet Edition. And once again, on the Arya, I actually preferred the stock cable from a sonic perspective. Once again, the ergonomics and the aesthetics of the Gladiator cable were clearly better, but I liked the fact that the stock cable and the HiFiMan Aryas kind of kept everything more together, more coherent once again, while I felt that the Gladiator cable kind of broke things apart a bit more and pushed everything further away from me. Again, it's going to be personal preference as to which you enjoy, but for me the Arya stock cable was actually the one that I'd want to listen to, even though the Gladiator was the one I'd want to actually live with and wear all the time. Strangely, on this occasion, and I can't explain this in any way, but I felt like on this occasion, the Gladiator cable was giving me a slightly more veiled sound from the Aryas, and so overall the sound was a bit less clear, a bit less defined, and yet also more broken apart. It was a little bit confusing overall to listen to, because it just didn't seem to be a good synergy. And as I said, I don't entirely know why that is. I don't know what the stock cable for the Arya, or the Verum one for that matter, I don't know what they're made of. And so I can't explain or even theorise what's going on here, but I definitely felt like in both cases the stock cable was better on both of these planars. And that got me wondering if maybe there's some kind of dynamics thing going on between how a dynamic driver responds to cable variations and how a planar magnetic might be responding. Of course, it could also be pure coincidence, but I thought what I might do was try one more headphone, this time a lower impedance dynamic driver. and so I reached for the HarmonicDyne Poseidons. For this test, one of the tracks I used was Let's Go by Khalid, and on the Poseidon, I'd have to say once again, I enjoyed both cables equally, that being the stock cable and the Gladiator cable. I felt like the stock cable on the Poseidons brought the vocal a bit more forward and a bit more separate from the mix, but it wasn't necessarily better than what I heard from the Gladiator cable, so much as just a slightly different presentation. With the stock cable, things like the percussion and the clicks were a bit more separated in the mix. I could hear them more distinctly placed around the soundstage. And I also felt like the stock cable was maybe bringing a better sense of punch and presence in the bass. But of course it was a fairly subtle shift. It wasn't a drastic change in the headphone's character, so much as minor adjustments in the overall presentation. Now it may sound like I'm preferring the stock cable here, but let me tell you what I liked about the Gladiator cable, and that is that the presentation with the Gladiator cable brought all of the frequencies more into balance from the Poseidon. The Poseidon is a bit lumpy and bumpy in its frequency response, and it was almost like the Gladiator cable was able to balance that out a bit. I don't think it's actually changing frequency responses. I've tried measuring frequency response with different cables before, and they don't seem to interact with the actual frequency response of the headphone, so much as I'm guessing something to do with the subtle timing of when different frequencies reach the ear. What I do know and can say though, is that when I went over to the Gladiator cable, it was like it somehow managed to bring all of the different frequencies into a better alignment. And what that meant was that things weren't as obviously separated, but as a result it was probably more coherent, and tonally it was more natural and more balanced to listen to. And so this left me in a really interesting position. I think the Gladiator cables are a fantastic option at their price, but I also think there's a degree of synergy between different driver types and the Gladiator cables. And so for me, based on the testing I've done so far, they're a cable that sonically I think is a great choice if you've got a dynamic driver headphone, and yet with planar magnetics, I don't know that I necessarily prefer them so much. Ergonomically though, if you want to throw all the sound stuff out of the window, ergonomically I think they're a great choice. They're a nice soft weave, they're very supple and easy to live with, they don't hold their shape, and Antonio finishes all of the cables with really high quality connectors. And so I'd say if you're in the market for a headphone cable and you want to keep it affordable, then definitely check out the Gladiator range of cables using the link down below. There's no affiliates, no kickbacks, no sponsorship there. It's just a way of saying thank you to Antonio for sending the cables out. And I should also mention that if you are looking for a more upgrade cable, more of a high-end cable, Antonio also has the Caesar range. I haven't tried them yet, so I can't comment on the quality, but having had a great and positive experience using the Gladiator range, I will be keen to talk to Antonio about trying out the Caesar range. And who knows, maybe in that review I'll discover that the Caesar range suits planars whilst the Gladiator range suits dynamic drivers. Maybe it's an impedance thing. I've got to do more hunting and more research on that one. For now though, I'm going to re-summarise this by saying that I think the Gladiator cables are one of the best value for money cables I've tried. They're right up there with something like the Heart Audio cables, albeit not offering that modularity, but I think sonically they're just maybe a little bit better. So as I said before, if you're in the market for a cable for your headphones, do check out the link down below through to Gladiator Cables. Thanks again to Antonio for sending these out. It was great to have a chance to try them, and I hope that you found this review useful and informative. Of course, if you have, I'd love it if you consider subscribing if you haven't already, and hitting the like button is a huge help to the channel as well. For now though, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.